Hello and welcome to our masterclass today, Actionable Steps for Decarbonisation. Today we will be joined by Cool Planet's very own Chief Strategy Officer, Ben Churchill, and our Director of Commercial Real Estate, Craig Needham. Today we will discuss how to calculate your emissions, how to set a target, and last but not least, how to get there. As always, if you have any questions or queries, please pop them in the chat box below and I will make sure to get an answer. Alternatively, email me at dean.brown@coolplanet.io. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our masterclass. Over to you, gentlemen.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Dean. Yeah, hiya, Ben.
Hi, Craig.
Yes.
How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Yeah, just I thought today it'd be interesting just to discuss just a few issues around decarbonisation. We've obviously just come off the back of COP27. There's a lot of talk at the moment around decarbonisation, around net zero. There's obviously, from a global perspective, every country has different targets and expectations and timelines as well. But it is obviously a big topic of discussion at the moment. So I thought it'd be just interesting to delve into a better understanding of decarbonisation and net zero. So from your sort of perspective and your understanding within the industry, what would you say initially actually is for the benefit of everybody else, what would you say actually is your understanding of net zero carbon?
Well, it's around understanding what your carbon footprint is in the first place, and then coming up with a program to get that to a point where you can make a meaningful offset of the last piece. So, whatever that carbon footprint is, you need to measure it to begin with, but then understand what actions you can take to reduce that carbon footprint. And there's always going to be a piece left. I mean, we can't get away from carbon completely. Then what measures can you take to offset that last piece to get to net zero?
Net zero, yeah. So maybe just a daft question then, but is there such a thing of actually ever achieving absolute zero?
Well, no. I mean, the reality is no. And carbon, let's remember, carbon is a natural thing. I mean, carbon exists. The issue today is our use of carbon and digging it out of the ground and putting it into the atmosphere. I mean, carbon in regular cycles is a necessary thing. I mean, we need it.
Yeah, exactly.
We just don't need that much of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So from understanding the net zero position, there's obviously a process associated with decarbonisation, and there's different sources of carbon, as you said, there's stuff that occurs naturally, but actually from the built environment and industry, there are different sources of carbon and different ways in which to measure it. Could you give a bit of an insight on that and the different sort of scopes that would be associated with it?
Yeah, so you hear lots of talk about scopes 1, 2, and 3, and they're part of the GHG protocols, so greenhouse gas protocol. So they just refer to where those sources are. So scope 1 are things you burn and things you produce yourself. So if you're burning gas, that's scope 1. If you're in the concrete industry and you're burning cement, that's scope 1 because CO2 comes out of the limestone that you burn. So that's scope 1. Scope 2 is carbon release from energy you buy. So if you buy electricity, the carbon that's produced in the production of that electricity is your scope 2. And then finally, scope 3 is everything else. It's indirect sources. So if you manufacture a product and that product uses carbon, it's the carbon in use. If you're buying products from manufacturers, it's the carbon in the product you've bought. It's things like business travel and distribution and things like that. Things that aren't necessarily you, but they're indirect, but they're consumed by you. Yeah,
so you might not necessarily have active control over the scope 3 emissions, but they still influence in terms of what you're measured against.
Yeah, and I think it's dangerous to say you don't have active control because you can do. A lot of people use it as an excuse. But the reality is it is part of your carbon footprint. So if you're going to do something about it, you need to do something about scope 3.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So I think probably for the benefit of today, we'll try and focus a little bit more on scope 1 and scope 2. So in terms of scope 1 and scope 2, they're sort of related to anything that you would consume in terms of fuel to either create an energy source. So we spoke about it a little bit earlier. Is it not then just as simple as buying green or renewable energy from your utility supplier?
Before I answer that question, I'll just challenge something else. I know we're saying we're focusing on scopes 1 and 2 here, but actually remember, one person's scope 1 and 2 is another person's scope 3. So in all of this, we're really dealing with scope 3 as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's a collective.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so this is really, really important for everybody. Let's just be clear on that.
Yeah. Excellent.
And you can go and buy green energy, of course, but as you'll see from the chart there, and very clear, you can't necessarily cover all the demand with green energy all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think particularly wind and sun blows or shines at different times, and currently the infrastructure on grids isn't capable of necessarily redistributing that power to meet all of the peak demand. So inevitably you are going to be consuming fossil fuels, and places like Ireland have got much better at this, at the proportion from green fuels, but you still just can't buy your way out of this problem for two reasons, actually. One is it becomes very expensive. If you're just going to continue to use as much as you want, prices are going up. There's no two ways about that. It's very expensive way of doing things. And two, it's not the right answer.
Yeah. So that's a very leading statement then that goes into the next question is, so what is the right answer? Is there a specific process that you would associate with the pathway to net zero?
Yeah, and it's not rocket science. It's use as little as you can. So reduce your energy, be more efficient, use it more effectively. So the first thing you do is, how do you reduce your consumption in the first place? Then you can start thinking about how do you reduce of what's left after you've been more efficient. How do you reduce the fossil fuel content of that? Now, one of those is using as much from the renewable space as possible. And there are various mechanisms to increase that. But that's kind of the first stage of the process you go through. And then whatever's left, then it becomes, how do I offset that? How do I find a way, and whether that's the emerging carbon capture systems or various other ways of kind of filling that last piece of the gap at the end.
There's lots of talk at the moment, especially over the past few years, with certain technologies, at the moment, heat pumps, the electrification of the grid. There's solutions out there, or technologies that are out there. So is it as straightforward as just, let's simplify it, let's put a heat pump in there, we'll electrify the heat, put solar PV in there, the use of electric vehicles? Is it just as straightforward as putting those technologies in there as part of that reduction plan, and that sort of takes care of that?
I'd like to say it is, but I'm going to say it isn't. It isn't. Definitely not that simple. And we talk to clients all the time, and one of the complaints they have about the industry is that people will come and say, you just need to put heat pumps everywhere. And when it comes to it, there's practicalities of actually how you do that. So that's a big challenge that we always come up against. And the reality as well is we have to think of these things systemically. So a lot of people will do efficiency work or be a manufacturer, and they'll sell you an efficient piece of equipment. But that on its own, it forms part of a system. So you have to think of how that whole system is going to work. And actually, you can get well beyond the manufacturer's technical promises, actually, if you think systemically around this. So a combination of the right hardware, the right software, the right smarts, data analytics, and various other things together provide the ultimate solution. Just one of these things on their own isn't really going to get you there at all.
I think that's a good point as well, actually, like you're saying about the smarts and the engineering resource and know-how as well, in terms of trying to understand every site specifically in terms of its requirements, but equally what is the art of possible from an engineering perspective as well. It's not something that can just be boxed up into a specific technology, is it?
Well, exactly. And when we're talking about decarbonisation, we tend to talk about three things: heating stuff, cooling stuff, moving stuff. And at a high level, it's quite simple. But actually, when you dig beneath that, it's much more complex than that, because these things actually require some substantial engineering. And I'll give you an example. If you decide that it's the right thing to do to use an electric vehicle fleet or transition to an electric vehicle fleet, which by the way, it is. Electrification is a core part of decarbonisation. But doing that isn't that simple, because if you suddenly start charging a load of electric vehicles off the site, the load goes up massively, and that load has to be matched against the ability for you to get the right level of green energy. So there's a lot of complexities in thinking around how you do this, but it also provides opportunities. So for example, if you bought the certain kinds of electric vehicles can redistribute charge back into the network at certain times. So you can buy green energy at one time when it's not being used, let's say it's overnight or something, and then use it during the day potentially. So there's a lot of smart thinking that could go into this, that yield a meaningful decarbonisation result that you can't do just by thinking about one piece of equipment or another piece of equipment. You have to think about it systemically.
Yeah. So holistically, it's that power play, isn't it, in terms of what energy you consume and where it's generated from, how it's utilized, time of day, all of the other things that play into it. And maybe not just, you know, in isolation, the building that you're in. It could be actually as a collective, maybe your estate, or even things that are you know, occurring around you.
Well, yeah, and we're, you know, a little way away from this, but as we go towards this and we're doing all of this electrification of all the things we need to, then the grid's going to have to be smarter, and it'll have to be sharing loads around things. And, you know, that happens today in the background. You probably don't notice it, and it probably will end up happening in the background in the future, but you still need to do it. So it becomes an important part of this journey, is just understanding how all of these things interact with each other, which is it's critical to keep us on this journey to net zero.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's an interesting point, actually. It's a journey, isn't it? You know, it's not just a one fix and it's resolved. This is going to be an ongoing journey. And as things develop over time, as processes change, as technologies change and software changes, then there'll be new ways of adding value to that process and that journey.
Yeah, well, you know, I kind of liken it a little bit to where health and safety was 20 years ago. So it used to be something that was done by the health and safety department, and there was probably a box ticking exercise. But, you know, if you talk about this in most businesses, you know, it's a core part of the workflow. It's right in the middle. It's in people's objectives. It's you know, one of the first things you talk about. And decarbonisation needs to be that thing. It needs to be in the middle of what people talk about all the time. And by doing that, it isn't, as you say, just a one-off. This is just something that becomes day-to-day business as usual.
Yeah, that's good. And so actually what, you know, we've looked at a few different technologies and the fact that actually there is a process around trying to start that journey of decarbonisation. But what would be the first process step within all of that? What would we say that we need to do in order to start it, you know, start it going?
Yeah, so you need to understand what you're emitting today, and you know there are many ways of doing that. There's lots of things you need to do that. So you know, you can quite easily get to a point where you can work out the carbon in the energy you're buying. The grid does have a variation on the level of carbon it has, but that data is available. So you can bring that data in and work out at any given time what carbon you've been consuming. Scope 1 as well. So that's scope 2, scope 1, the things you burn, you can measure relatively straightforwardly. So actually scopes 1 and 2 are relatively easy. Gets a little harder with scope 3. There are various things called emissions factors you can use to give a broad brush. We don't really rate those, actually. So we much prefer to go deeper and measure what's really going on.
Yeah.
But it's certainly the first thing to do, kind of where are you today? And I think it's important that if you really want to do meaningful decarbonisation, you have to treat this like a P&L in a business. So you wouldn't run a business based on an annual report. You have to have a management account. You think the same way. You can't do a decarbonisation based on what your carbon was last year. You need a real-time effect, well, at least monthly view of what your carbon footprint is.
Yeah. That's fascinating, actually, because the point there that you made about the grid, you know, at different times and different uses has different amounts of carbon that's emitted with that process. So it's not just as straightforward as taking an aggregate or an average value, you know, whilst that's a start, it doesn't give you like you say, that P&L detail to understand what's happening within that month.
No, exactly. But this is where actually we can start being a lot smarter, because if you're aware of the carbon content of the grid at any given time, you can actually move things around to take advantage of it. So, you know, there could be a scenario if you're in a manufacturing space and you can be flexible at the times you manufacture, and there's a a really windy day and you can get some data on how much of the grid content is green at the moment, maybe you do more manufacturing then and shut it down when on a less windy day. I mean, there's all sorts that can happen with data.
What sort of granularity of data would you ideally want to get to? I mean, is it as simple as just capturing the main meters to the building itself, or is it beneficial to get more than that?
Well, it's certainly beneficial to get more, but getting main meter data is a really good start. So, I'm always amazed by how little information that people really have tapped into already. So we'll very, very frequently talk to companies who don't have any kind of real access to their own main meter data, let alone any sub-metering. And just with main meter data, and I was working on a project with a client this week, just looking at how a business is using with the opening hours of the business, you can work out what the base load should be, you can work out what you're actually doing and identify waste immediately just off main meter data. And that's just very simple. And that's without going down into sub-metering to work out what are the main energy users and how you can optimize those. So there's definitely a journey you can go on in this, and it's one to be with you for life, I think.
I'd imagine as well that can be quite a surprise to some clients, can't they? Where they set the expectation of, we do a good job with what we're doing, and we've got our energy usage down as low as we can possibly get it.
Well, I think it's certainly a surprise, but there's also a mentality that your bill's just what it is, and you pay it. A known cost or a cost, and I think. But two things have happened. One is people are going, well, you need to decarbonize, so people are taking a look at it. And two, with energy prices doing what they're doing, this cost has suddenly become really big.
Yeah, definitely.
The finance guys going, whoa, why are we paying this? Can we do something? And the answer is you can.
Yeah. And I think the other reality now is the actual energy risk. The costs are fluctuating so much, but equally the reality is that the generation of electricity is probably quite a fragile process at the moment as well. So we're looking at times that probably, go back into the 70s and stuff when we had blackouts, especially in the UK, but, equally we're looking at scenarios that could become a reality again.
Look, there's definitely a possibility, and a lot more investment needs to go into infrastructure to support more renewables on the grid. And that's a really, really important part of this process. But there's simple stuff you can do. So you can, a domestic example for me, I'm looking at putting a transfer switch so I can use my car to power my house. But that's actually an example of something you could do in commercial purposes for decarbonisation, because you can use vehicles to consume energy at low cost and green times and put them back into to use it in other times. So that's
fascinating.
It's a really interesting set of technologies that are developing.
Yeah, definitely. So once we've managed to sort of capture that data and we've come up with an understanding of exactly what it is that we're emitting at the moment, is it as logical as just going on to that next step of saying, right, well, this is what we want to achieve? We know like 2050 is a target, 2030 is a target, as self-imposed for certain countries and certain cities. Is it as simple as saying, right, we're going to meet those requirements by that sort of time scale, or is it something that should have a bit more of an engagement and a thought process around?
It definitely needs a thought process. I mean, the emerging standard for this is science-based targets. So that has a process for target setting, and I think, and I support that as a way of doing things. Now, my observation of this is there are plenty of people who set science-based targets, and they're supposed to be based on some reality of what's possible. Yet these companies have no idea how they're going to actually do this. So there is a massive gap in execution in all of this. How do you actually execute on those targets that have been set? And again, part of it comes down to a problem that a lot of people are using baseline data that is a year, 2 years old. It's annual. It's not really, as I said, you can't manage a company from an annual report. You need a management account. So there's a big gap in having that information available to people so they can make better decisions. Because you think about this, if you're making a decarbonisation, creating an opportunity and making an intervention in something, and you can't see whether it's worked for 12 months, how are you going to know whether you're on track or not, or course correct? It's impossible.
Yeah. And I can imagine also I mean, we know at the moment there's probably somewhat of a lack of understanding in terms of what all of these different requirements are from a high level, but equally, when you think about it from an individual building perspective, there's got to be a challenge with individuals understanding what are the opportunities that they could deploy. They might have an understanding of specific process or a specific building and operation and things like that, but it becomes somewhat of a challenge, I'd imagine, for these people just to know exactly what it is that they could be doing. That there almost needs to be a tool there associated with trying to help them throughout that process.
It is, and kind of to steal an analogy from another kind of business domain, if you're in sales, trying to manage a sales pipeline without some form of CRM, customer relationship management software, whether that's Salesforce, HubSpot, Zoho, whatever they are, it doesn't really matter. It is a really difficult process. So how can you be expected to manage a decarbonisation, A, without having relatively up-to-date data, and B, without having something to manage your pipeline of opportunities and roadmap to net zero? You need to be able to say, I've got this idea to do something. I'm going to now test that idea, kind of get some more specifics on it, quantify it, etc., create a business case, and then execute it, and then manage that execution. And you need to just keep relentlessly doing that as part of what you're doing as a day-to-day business. And by the way, there are knock-on benefits to this. So in manufacturing, for example, most of the energy consuming things are in the manufacturing process. You can make the process more efficient. You can make more money. And for me, actually, this just smacks of opportunity. How can you make your decarbonisation roadmap and workflow be part of your differential ability with the thing you sell or the thing you do? And I think you can.
It needs to be fully incorporated within the business so that everybody can engage with it as well, doesn't it? It can't just be one individual that's banging the drum.
Well, it is, and if you're in a B2B environment, you're going to find that if you win work through tender, it's going to be asked for in tenders. People are going to expect that you can tell them what you're doing about stuff.
Yeah.
So it comes back to, if you've got no tools to be able to understand what you're doing today, how you're managing your decarbonisation pipeline, how can you possibly communicate properly with someone about that?
And I suppose it's the level of influence that others within the business can have as well, isn't it? Because business and buildings change constantly. There's influencing factors directly and indirectly. So actually, if it's something that sits behind the scenes that people can't engage with, then they won't understand by them undertaking a action, it could negatively impact on what that process is.
Well, exactly. So having that visibility is critical, but then kind of thinking that in a wider perspective, if you're part of an organization where things are going on all over the place, you want to be able to share all of those successes. So, if let's say you did have a particular project with a heat pump system that worked really, really well, you need to be able to say, hey, look, everybody else, you can do the same thing. Everybody, you might be in retail, all your shops are the same. Why didn't you do this here? This is the result we got. Share that out. And then aggregate that up to an organization to say, look, here's how this has affected our decarbonisation roadmap.
Yeah, that's good, actually. So sharing that engineering excellence, that resource of opportunities that people have had success with, and making sure that other people can enjoy that success as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, so I think it's key, throughout all of this, that the specific steps associated with that decarbonisation roadmap, it's definitively, it is a journey. But if you sort of had potentially sort of 3 takeaway points out of what we've discussed today, is there anything that you think, as a minimum, people need to be going away from this and thinking about and taking some actionable insight from?
So measure it in the first place. What gets measured gets done. Set yourself some meaningful targets and focus on execution.
Brilliant. Appreciate that, Ben. Thanks for your time.
It's great to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig and Ben. I think we all learned a lot from there. I know I did. So as mentioned before, please email me at dean.brown@coolplanet.io with any questions or queries, and I will make sure to get an answer. Alternatively, give us a call if you want to have a chat with one of our expert engineers. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed our masterclass. Thank you and goodbye.